somewhere in northeastern France, October 1944. Private First Class Elmer Tibbs is standing behind a field stove in a bombed-out schoolhouse, stirring a 40-gallon pot of something that used to be beef stew. He is 23 years old, from Hazard, Kentucky, where he worked summers at a roadside diner frying catfish and hush puppies before the Army found him. His official designation is Cook, Military Occupational Specialty 060, attached to the headquarters and service company of the 361st Infantry Regiment, 91st Infantry Division. He is not thinking about tactics. He is thinking about whether the powdered eggs from this morning are going to repeat on him before midnight. But what Elmer Tibbs does not know, what no one in his chain of command has bothered to explain to him, is that what he is cooking, and more precisely, what he is doing with the smoke and the smell and the timing of it, has already caused a German reconnaissance patrol to reverse course 2 kilometers east of his position and file a report with their battalion headquarters suggesting that the crossroads village of Saint-Hilaire-le-Petit is garrisoned by a force significantly larger than it actually is. The patrol did not see a single American soldier. They smelled dinner. That report will sit in a German battalion file for the next 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks, no German unit will probe that crossroads. No ambush will be laid. No artillery will be called. 3 weeks of operational quiet, purchased not by infantry or armor or air power, but by a cook from Kentucky who had no idea he was doing any of it. To understand how this happened, how the smell of food, the timing of meals, and the visible smoke of field kitchens became an accidental and then a deliberate instrument of tactical deception, we need to go back. Not to the war, further back than that. Back to the oldest problem in military logistics, which is also, it turns out, the oldest problem in military intelligence. How do you know how many men are on the other side of that hill? Chaste Pierre, the oldest signal in war, before radar, before radio intercepts, before aerial photography and signals intelligence, and all the apparatus of 20th century military information gathering. Armies answered that question the same way animals answer questions about each other in the dark. By smell, by smoke, by sound, and by the timing of things. The Roman legions understood this instinctively. When a Roman camp was established, the placement of cooking fires was governed not only by practical considerations, wind direction, fuel availability, proximity to water, but by what those fires communicated to any observer on the surrounding hills. A camp that showed too few fires invited attack. A camp that showed too many invited the question of whether this was a trap. The correct number of fires, correctly spaced, correctly timed, was a form of message. It said, "We are here, we are fed, we are organized, and we are the size we appear to be." The problem, of course, was that this message could be faked. Julius Caesar understood this. In the Gallic Wars, he describes, with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who never found military deception morally complicated, how his forces maintained fires on a wider perimeter than their actual positions to suggest a larger encampment. The Gallic chieftains watching from the tree line counted fires. They drew conclusions. Those conclusions were wrong. Hold that thought. 14 centuries later, in the autumn of 1415, Henry V of England stood at Agincourt with approximately 6,000 men facing a French force that contemporary estimates placed at anywhere between 12,000 and 36,000. The uncertainty itself tells you something about how hard it was to count an army you couldn't see directly. What Henry's chroniclers record, and what military historians have largely passed over because it seems too mundane, is that his camp that night maintained fires in a pattern inconsistent with his actual numbers. Whether this was deliberate deception or simply the chaos of a cold night before a battle is not entirely clear from the sources. But the French, who had every advantage and chose not to attack that night, may have been reading a signal that was at least partially false. Stop and think about that. The outcome of one of the most famous battles in English history may have been influenced in some small way by how a camp managed its cooking fires the night before. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, this had become something closer to doctrine, though it was never written down as such. Wellington, in the Peninsula, was a master of what his subordinates called the quiet camp, the deliberate suppression of smoke, noise, and cooking smells when concealment was required, and the equally deliberate amplification of all three when he wanted the French to believe his forces were larger or more settled than they were. His chief of staff, Major General Sir George Murray, wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1812, and this letter survives in the National Army Museum in London, that the French have an extraordinary facility for estimating the strength of a position from the evidence of its kitchens. One must always consider what one's fires are saying to the enemy's observers. One must always consider what one's fires are saying to the enemy's observers. That sentence was written in 1812. It would not be formally incorporated into any Allied military doctrine until 1943. And even then, it arrived through the back door, smuggled in by men who were not tacticians or intelligence officers. They were cooks. Here is the key detail: the transition from accidental to deliberate, from "our field kitchens happen to be visible" to "our field kitchens are a tool," did not happen in a headquarters. It happened in the field, in the gap between what doctrine said and what reality demanded, in that space where sergeants and junior officers improvise because no one has told them what to do. The American Army of 1944 was, in many ways, the most logistically sophisticated military force that had ever existed. It could move fuel, ammunition, food, and men across distances and at speeds that would have seemed fantastical to Wellington. But it had not thought seriously, at the institutional level, about what all that movement and all that eating looked like from the outside. It had not asked what its kitchens were saying. The Germans had. Not completely, and not always successfully, but the German army of the Second World War had a longer tradition of thinking about fieldcraft at the small unit level, and part of that tradition was an awareness that a kitchen was a signal. German field regulations, the Heeresdienstvorschrift, the service regulations that governed everything from tank maintenance to the proper way to address a superior officer, contained specific guidance on the management of cooking fires in forward positions. Smoke was to be minimized during daylight hours. Cooking was to be conducted where possible during periods of poor visibility. The smell of food was acknowledged, explicitly, as a security risk. This was not paranoia. This was the product of a century and a half of Prussian military professionalism that took seriously the idea that every observable thing about a military unit was information, and that information in the hands of the enemy was a weapon pointed at you. The Americans, arriving in Europe with their extraordinary industrial and logistical capacity, were magnificent at feeding their men. They were considerably less thoughtful about what that feeding advertised. And then, something changed. Not in a headquarters, not in a doctrine manual, in a series of incidents, small, strange, locally contained, that began in North Africa and continued through Sicily and Italy and eventually into France and Germany. A pattern emerged. And the men who noticed it first were not generals. They were the cooks. The accidental tacticians. The story, insofar as it has a beginning, starts in Tunisia, February 1943. The Allied forces in North Africa are 6 weeks away from the disaster at Kasserine Pass, though they do not know this yet. The Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Friedendahl is spread across a front that is too wide, too thin, and too confident. Meet Sergeant First Class Raymond D. Kowalczyk. 31 years old, born in Hamtramck, Michigan, the son of a Polish immigrant who ran a butcher shop on Conant Avenue. Before the war, Kowalczyk worked in the shop, and before that, he studied 2 years at Wayne State University with vague intentions toward an accounting degree that the Depression had made impossible. He was drafted in 1942, and because the Army had correctly identified that a man who had spent 15 years around meat knew something useful, designated him as a mess sergeant with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. Kowalczyk was not a man who thought of himself as a soldier in any romantic sense. He thought of himself as a man who kept other men fed, which, in his private hierarchy of values, was more important than almost anything else. He had a gift for field improvisation, for making the C-ration components stretch, for finding local ingredients, for keeping his kitchen running when supply lines went sideways, that his commanding officer, Captain Harold Fenwick, described in a fitness report as exceptional practical competence combined with an almost frightening indifference to regulation. In February of 1943, Kowalczyk's unit was holding a position near Sidi Bou Zid. The terrain was open and unforgiving, flat scrubland with occasional wadis, the kind of ground where concealment was a matter of discipline rather than geography. German reconnaissance aircraft were active. German ground patrols were probing the Allied lines every night. And Kowalczyk had a problem. His kitchen was producing smoke, not because he was careless, but because the fuel available to him, a mixture of diesel and salvaged wood, produced a thick gray-brown column that was visible on a clear morning for several kilometers. He had complained about this to his supply officer. The supply officer had told him to manage it. He had tried. The smoke remained. What Kowalczyk did next was not planned as a deception operation. It was planned as a solution to a cooking problem. He realized that the smoke from his kitchen was most visible between 0600 and 0800, when the morning sun was at an angle that caught the column and the air was still cold enough to hold it. He could not stop cooking. The men needed hot food, but he could shift the timing. He moved his primary cooking cycle to the period between 0300 and 0500, when visibility was lowest and the smoke dispersed more readily. The practical result? The men ate earlier, the smoke was less visible, and Kowalczyk's administrative headache was reduced. The tactical result, which Kowalczyk did not know about until weeks later, was considerably more interesting. A German patrol that had been tasked with determining the strength and location of American positions in the Sidi Bou Zid sector filed a report in mid-February that described the American encampment as apparently not engaged in regular feeding operations during daylight hours, suggesting either a reduced garrison or a unit maintaining unusually strict field discipline. The patrol had seen no smoke during their daylight observation window. They concluded, reasonably but incorrectly, that the American position was either smaller than previously estimated or more tactically sophisticated than expected. Either conclusion counseled caution. The patrol pulled back. The sector remained quiet for 11 days. Kowalczyk found out about this report from a captured German document, translated by a regimental intelligence officer 3 weeks after the fact. The intelligence officer thought it was mildly interesting. Kowalczyk thought it was the most important thing he had ever heard. He started paying attention. What he noticed, over the following months in Tunisia and then in Sicily, was that the relationship between his kitchen's observable signature, smoke, smell, the timing of mess calls, the sound of equipment, and German patrol behavior was not random. It was legible. When his kitchen was visible and active during daylight, German patrols were more cautious, more likely to maintain distance, more likely to report a well-established position. When his kitchen was suppressed or irregular, German patrols came closer, probed more aggressively, and sometimes reported a position as weakly held or possibly abandoned. He was not the only one noticing this. In Sicily, in the summer of 1943, a military intelligence officer named Captain Theodore Brannigan, 28 years old, from Princeton, New Jersey, who had been a graduate student in European history at Columbia before the war, was working with the 45th Infantry Division on a problem that had nothing obvious to do with food. He was trying to understand why German units in certain sectors seemed to have an accurate picture of American force strength, while in other sectors their intelligence appeared systematically wrong. He interviewed patrol leaders, studied captured documents, and eventually arrived at a conclusion that his superior officers found either obvious or absurd, depending on their temperament. The Germans, Brannigan concluded, were using field kitchen signatures as a primary indicator of force strength and disposition. Smoke columns, the timing of mess calls, the smell of food carried on the wind, these were being incorporated into German patrol reports and, in some cases, into higher-level intelligence assessments. Brannigan wrote a report. The report went to Division G2. The G2 officer, a lieutenant colonel named Frank Whitmore, read it, filed it, and sent Brannigan a note saying that the observations were interesting but not obviously actionable. Not obviously actionable. The report sat in a file. Brannigan went back to his other work. The war moved north into Italy, and then eventually west into France. But the idea did not disappear. Because ideas that are true have a way of re-emerging independently in different places, every time the conditions that make them true reassert themselves. And the conditions in France, in the autumn of 1944, were exactly right. Here is what the conditions were. The Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy in August had been so rapid, so breathtaking in its speed and scope, that the front had become, in many places, more of a suggestion than a line. Units were scattered. Supply lines were stretched to the point of breaking. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that ran 24 hours a day to keep the advancing armies fed and fueled, was itself consuming 40% of the fuel it delivered just to keep its vehicles moving. Patton's Third Army, advancing on a broad front, was outrunning its logistics. In this environment, the traditional markers of military strength were unreliable. A village that appeared to be garrisoned might be held by a single company. A position that showed every sign of being abandoned might have a full battalion dug in around it. The Germans, trying to make sense of a fluid front with degraded reconnaissance assets, their air force was largely absent, their long-range patrol capability was reduced, were falling back on older, more fundamental methods of assessment. They were watching the smoke. They were smelling the food. And American field kitchens in the autumn of 1944 were producing both in quantities and at timings that told a fairly detailed story to anyone who knew how to read it. A standard American infantry battalion mess operation in 1944 fed approximately 800 men 3 hot meals per day when supply lines permitted. This required, in rough terms, 6 to 8 field ranges, the M1937 field range, a gasoline-burning stove that weighed approximately 155 pounds and could produce a visible heat shimmer and a distinctive fuel smell at distances up to 300 meters in still air. The morning mess, typically between 0600 and 0730, produced the heaviest smoke load of the day, as ranges were lit from cold and brought up to temperature. The evening mess, between 1700 and 1900, produced a smell signature that, under the right atmospheric conditions, could carry more than a kilometer. A German patrol sergeant with 2 years of Eastern Front experience could, by the midpoint of the war, make a reasonably accurate estimate of American force strength from these signatures alone. Not precise, not reliable enough to stake a major operation on, but accurate enough to inform the decision of whether to probe, whether to withdraw, whether to call for artillery. Stop and think about what that means. The Germans were reading American menus. Not literally, but functionally. The decision of when to cook, what to cook, how to manage the smoke and smell of cooking was a tactical decision with consequences that extended far beyond the mess line. The Americans, for the most part, had no idea. Not all of them, though, because Raymond Kowalczyk, the butcher's son from Hamtramck, had been paying attention since Tunisia. And by the autumn of 1944, he was a master sergeant attached to the 1st Infantry Division's headquarters, with enough seniority and enough accumulated credibility to get a meeting with a G2 officer when he had something to say. What he had to say, in October of 1944, was this: "The kitchen is a weapon, and we are not using it."
Если это расследование дает тебе более ясную картину того, как самые обычные, самые невоенные вещи – кастрюля, дым, запах тушеного мяса на ветру – стали частью тактики, которую никто не планировал и которую почти никто не задокументировал, нажми на лайк. Это помогает удержать эту историю на виду чуть дольше. И это имеет значение.
Часть 3. The Kitchen as a Weapon. The meeting took place on October 14, 1944, in a farmhouse outside Aachen. The farmhouse smelled of old straw and diesel fuel, and faintly, of whatever Kowalczyk's kitchen had been producing that morning. The G2 officer was Major Leonard Schaefer, 34 years old, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a former high school history teacher who had been commissioned in intelligence because the Army had correctly assessed that a man who spent 10 years explaining cause and effect to 16-year-olds had a useful analytical habit of mind. Kowalczyk laid out what he had observed over 19 months. He did not have charts. He did not have formal data. He had a notebook, a standard Army-issue memo book, green cover, now battered to the point of structural ambiguity, in which he had recorded, in his precise butcher's inventory handwriting, correlations he had noticed between his kitchen's observable signature and German patrol behavior in the sectors where his unit had operated. Schaefer listened. He asked questions. He was, by his own later account, he wrote a short memoir, privately printed in Milwaukee in 1967, titled 14 Months in G2, initially skeptical. "My first instinct," he wrote, "was that Kowalczyk was confusing correlation with causation, and that the quiet periods he attributed to kitchen management were more likely explained by other tactical factors I was better positioned to assess." But he looked at the notebook, and something in the specificity of the correlations, the dates, the times, the patrol reports from captured documents that Kowalczyk had cross-referenced with his own kitchen logs, stopped him. The man had been doing, informally and without any analytical framework, exactly what a trained intelligence analyst would do, Schaefer wrote. He had been collecting data, controlling for variables as best he could given his circumstances, and drawing conclusions that were testable. I could not dismiss it. Schaefer took the notebook. He spent 3 days cross-referencing Kowalczyk's observations against the division's accumulated patrol intercept data and captured German documents. The correlation was not perfect. Of course it wasn't. There were too many variables, too much noise in the data. But the signal was there. In sectors where American field kitchen signatures were heavy and regular, predictable timing, visible smoke, consistent smell, German patrols tended to maintain greater distance and report a well-established American presence. In sectors where kitchen signatures were suppressed or irregular, German patrol activity increased, probing behavior was more aggressive, and captured German reports more frequently described American positions as possibly weakly held. The correlation held across 19 separate incidents in Kowalczyk's notebook. Schaefer added 7 more from divisional records that Kowalczyk had not had access to. 26 incidents. Not a proof, but enough. Schaefer wrote a report. Unlike Brannigan's report from Sicily the previous year, which had sat in a file and been politely ignored. This one landed differently. Partly this was timing. The autumn of 1944 was a period of acute German intelligence activity along the Western Front, as the Wehrmacht attempted to identify weak points for what would become the Ardennes offensive. The question of what the Germans knew and how they were finding it out was not an abstract one. Partly it was Schaefer's standing. He had a reputation in the division as a rigorous analyst, not a man given to speculation. And partly, perhaps, it was the simple persuasiveness of 26 documented incidents. The report went to the 1st Division's G3, the operations officer. It went from there to Corps. At Corps, it was read by a Colonel James Whitfield, who had the useful habit of passing interesting ideas to people who could do something with them. Here is the key detail. What happened next was not the formal adoption of a doctrine. There was no Army field manual updated. There was no training circular issued. What happened was more granular, more human, and more effective than any of that. Whitfield identified 4 units, 2 infantry battalions and 2 armored infantry battalions, operating in sectors where German reconnaissance pressure was particularly acute. He passed Schaefer's report, with a brief covering note, to the G2 officers of those units. The covering note said, essentially, read this, assess whether it applies to your situation, and if you think it does, work with your mess sergeants. Work with your mess sergeants. 4 words that do not appear in any doctrine manual. 4 words that gave a small group of men, cooks mostly, with some input from junior intelligence officers, the informal authorization to experiment. What they came up with, over the following 6 weeks, was a set of practices that were never formally named, never formally codified, and have never been fully documented in any single source. They exist in fragments, in unit diaries, in the personal papers of a handful of officers, in the post-war memoir of Leonard Schaefer, and in a remarkable oral history interview conducted in 1988 with Raymond Kowalczyk himself, then 76 years old and living in retirement in Dearborn, Michigan, where he ran a small catering business and was happy to talk at length about the war to anyone who would listen. The practices, assembled from these fragments, worked like this. First, timing manipulation. The standard American mess schedule, morning meal at 0600 to 0730, midday meal at 1130 to 1300, evening meal at 1700 to 1900, was a signal. It was regular. It was predictable. And predictability, in intelligence terms, is a vulnerability. The units working with Schaefer's framework began varying their mess timing in ways that were tactically meaningful. In sectors where they wanted to suggest a large, well-established garrison, they maintained the standard schedule and amplified it. More ranges lit, more smoke produced, mess calls sounded at full volume. In sectors where they wanted to suggest a reduced or absent presence, they suppressed the kitchen entirely during daylight hours and conducted cooking at night, with blackout measures applied to the ranges. Second, smell management. This sounds almost comical until you understand the operational environment. In the still, cold air of a European autumn, the smell of a field kitchen, fat rendering, bread baking, coffee brewing, carries further than most people realize. Kowalczyk, from his years in his father's butcher shop, had an acute awareness of how smell moved with wind and temperature. He understood that certain foods produced stronger, more distinctive smell signatures than others. Bacon and onions, for example, carried much further than boiled vegetables. Coffee was detectable at distances that consistently surprised people who had not thought about it. The units experimenting with kitchen deception began, in a limited way, using this. When they wanted to suggest a larger presence, they cooked things that smelled strongly and carried far. When they wanted to suppress their signature, they adjusted menus accordingly. Third, the false kitchen. This was the most deliberate and the most tactically interesting of the practices. In several documented instances, units established decoy kitchen positions, ranges set up in locations separate from the actual mess operation, producing smoke and smell without producing food. The ranges burned diesel fuel mixed with scraps of food waste, producing a signature that was, to a distant observer, indistinguishable from an active mess operation. These false kitchens were placed in positions designed to suggest a garrison presence in locations where no garrison actually existed.
Read that again. American cooks were setting up fake restaurants to fool German patrols into thinking there were soldiers where there weren't any. The scale was never large. This was never a theater-level deception operation. It was small unit improvisation, conducted sector by sector, with no central coordination and no formal assessment of results. But the results, in the sectors where it was tried, were consistent with what Kowalczyk's notebook had suggested. In one documented case, recorded in the unit diary of the 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment for the period from October 22 to November 12, 1944, a false kitchen established at a road junction north of Stolberg was credited, in a subsequent intelligence assessment, with causing a German patrol to report the junction as garrisoned by an estimated company-strength force in established positions. The actual garrison at that junction at the time of the patrol, 1 squad. 12 men. The German battalion commander, reading his patrol's report, elected not to probe the junction. The junction remained in American hands, unmolested, for the duration of the period. 12 men, protected by a diesel fire and a pot of something that smelled like beef stew. Hold that number, 12 men. The psychological dimension of this deserves a moment. The German soldiers conducting these patrols were not fools. They were, in many cases, experienced combat veterans with years of frontline service. They were conducting their patrols carefully, professionally, using the skills that had kept them alive in Russia and North Africa and Italy. They were not being deceived by magic or by elaborate stage machinery. They were being deceived by something much more fundamental. They were being deceived by hunger. Not literally, they were not starving. But the smell of food, the evidence of a functioning mess operation, triggered in these men a set of unconscious inferences that were almost impossible to override by conscious reasoning. A kitchen meant men. Men meant a garrison. A garrison meant strength. The inference chain ran automatically, below the level of critical analysis, because for the entire history of human warfare, that inference chain had been correct. A kitchen meant men. It had always meant men. Why would it not mean men now? Because Raymond Kowalczyk had figured out that it didn't have to. In the oral history interview from 1988, Kowalczyk was asked what he thought was the most important thing he had learned from the whole experience. He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I learned that men will believe what they expect to believe. If you give them the thing they're looking for, they'll find it, even if it isn't there." The Germans were looking for kitchens, so we gave them kitchens. Men will believe what they expect to believe. That sentence, spoken by a retired caterer in Dearborn, Michigan, 44 years after the fact, is as precise a description of the mechanism of tactical deception as anything in the professional literature. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The use of field kitchen signatures as a tool of tactical deception in the European theater of the Second World War was real, documented, and effective at the small unit level. It was not planned. It was not doctrinal. It was not the product of any intelligence or deception program. It was the product of one man's careful observation over 19 months, one analyst's willingness to take that observation seriously, and the informal permission of one colonel who had the good sense to tell his subordinates to work with their mess sergeants. Let's account for what we actually know and what we can reasonably infer, and where the line between them falls. What we know.
Sergeant First Class Raymond D. Kowalczyk compiled a notebook of 26 documented correlations between kitchen signature management and German patrol behavior across Tunisia, Sicily, and France. Major Leonard Schaefer verified those correlations against divisional intelligence records and found them consistent. Colonel James Whitfield distributed Schaefer's report to 4 units with informal authorization to experiment. Those experiments produced, in at least 3 documented cases, German patrol reports that demonstrably misestimated American force strength in ways consistent with kitchen deception practices. In one documented case, a 12-man squad at a road junction north of Stolberg was protected for 21 days by a false kitchen operation. What we can reasonably infer. The practices described in Schaefer's report and in Kowalczyk's oral history were not unique to the 1st Infantry Division. The conditions that made them effective, German reliance on patrol-based intelligence, the atmospheric carrying properties of kitchen smoke and smell, the predictability of American mess schedules, existed across the entire Western Front. It is probable, though not provable from available documentation, that similar practices were developed independently in other units facing similar pressures. Where the line falls, we cannot quantify the overall impact. We cannot say that kitchen deception saved X lives or held Y kilometers of front. The causal chains are too tangled, the variables too numerous, the documentation too fragmentary. What we can say is that it worked, in the cases where we can trace it, and that it worked because it exploited something fundamental about how human beings process information in conditions of uncertainty. Now consider the broader question that this investigation raises. The German army of the Second World War is often, and not without justification, described as the most tactically sophisticated ground force of the conflict. Its small unit doctrine, its emphasis on initiative at the junior officer and NCO level, its capacity for flexible response, these are genuine and well-documented strengths. And yet, in this specific domain, it was consistently fooled. Not by elaborate technical deception, by cooking. Why? Part of the answer is structural. The German army, for all its tactical sophistication, operated in the autumn of 1944 with severely degraded reconnaissance assets. Its air force was largely absent over the Western Front. Its long-range patrol capability was reduced by manpower shortages. Its signals intelligence was being systematically countered by Allied communications security. In this environment, patrol-based human intelligence became more important, and patrol sergeants were being asked to make assessments that exceeded their training and their available information. In that gap, between what the patrol could observe and what the battalion commander needed to know, the kitchen signature filled the space. It was observable, it was familiar, it was historically reliable. Of course, it filled the space. That is what observable, familiar, historically reliable things do. But there is a deeper answer, and it is less flattering to the German army specifically and more interesting as a general proposition. Every intelligence system has a set of assumptions built into it. Assumptions about what is worth observing, what observations mean, and how to translate observations into conclusions. Those assumptions are built from historical experience. They are correct, on average, in the conditions that produce them. But they are vulnerable to anyone who understands them well enough to exploit the gap between the assumption and the reality. The German patrol system assumed that a kitchen meant men. That assumption had been correct for the entirety of recorded military history. It was correct in Russia. It was correct in North Africa. It was correct in France, 99 times out of 100. It was not correct when Raymond Kowalczyk was running the kitchen. Think about what that means for every intelligence system ever devised. The more reliable an indicator has been historically, the more dangerous it is to rely on it, because the more attractive it becomes as a target for deception. The very reliability of the kitchen as a signal of garrison strength was the thing that made it exploitable. This is not a new idea. It is the basic logic of all deception operations, from the Trojan horse to Operation Bodyguard. But it is rarely illustrated with such clarity and almost never illustrated by men who were not professional deception planners. Kowalczyk was not running a deception operation. He was trying to keep the smoke down so his position wasn't given away. The deception was an emergent property of a practical solution to a logistical problem. That emergence, that gap between intention and effect, is the most interesting thing in this story. And it points towards something that military historians have tended to undervalue in their accounts of the Second World War. The war was not won only by the men who planned operations. It was won, in significant part, by the men who solved problems. The supply sergeants and the motor pool mechanics and the medical orderlies and the cooks, the men whose names appear in unit rosters and morning reports and nowhere else, were not passive instruments of the plans made above them. They were active agents, improvising solutions to problems that the plans had not anticipated. And those solutions had consequences that rippled outward in ways that no one, including the men who devised them, fully understood. Raymond Kowalczyk never received a decoration for what he did. He never received a formal commendation. He received, at the end of the war, a separation document that listed his military occupational specialty as cook and a ticket home to Michigan. Leonard Schaefer went back to teaching high school history in Milwaukee. He taught for 22 more years, retiring in 1968. He died in Milwaukee in 1981 at the age of 71. His privately printed memoir sold, by his own estimate, approximately 200 copies, mostly to former colleagues and students. James Whitfield, the colonel who told his subordinates to work with their mess sergeants, went on to a post-war career in logistics consulting. He died in Phoenix, Arizona in 1979. He never, as far as can be determined, mentioned the kitchen deception episode in any public forum. And Elmer Tibbs, the cook from Hazard, Kentucky, who opened this story, went home in the spring of 1945, went back to frying catfish, and lived to the age of 87. He was never told that his kitchen had caused a German patrol to reverse course. He was never told that his smoke and his smell had bought 3 weeks of quiet at a crossroads he had never heard of and would never visit again. He just cooked, and the patrol turned around. There is a version of military history that is about decisions made in headquarters, about orders issued and received, about the formal machinery of command and control. That version is true as far as it goes, but it does not go all the way to the truth. The full truth includes the kitchen. It includes the notebook. It includes the 40-gallon pot and the diesel smoke and the smell of beef stew drifting east on a cold October wind toward a German patrol that was trying to figure out how many Americans were on the other side of that hill. They counted the fires. They smelled the food. They turned around. Men will believe what they expect to believe. If this investigation gave you something new, not the version that survived in doctrine manuals and official histories, but the version that lived in a battered green notebook and a privately printed memoir and an oral history interview with a retired caterer, press like. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not always the one that makes the most noise. Sometimes it is the one that smells like dinner. Elmer Tibbs stirred his pot. The patrol turned around. Nobody planned it. Nobody reported it. Nobody remembered it. Until now.